Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the second day of the seminar, the labor market education and digitalization in the onset of post-COVID-19 pandemic. It is my privilege today to welcome all the participants. Thank you all the persons who are here at the auditorium and all those who follow this seminar via remotely via Zoom and YouTube. Yesterday, after the institutional presentations, our key talk speakers present the plenary talks about the Mexican economy during the pandemic and post-pandemic, and the relationship between comorbidities and COVID-19 deaths in the pandemic in Mexico. Later, two interesting talks are held about segmented labor markets and the risk of transitioning into health insurance deprivation for the working age population in Mexico. They are disponible in the IIEc's YouTube channel. Today, we are going to continue our seminar with four unmissable talks about diverse topics. First, our speakers talk about how to measure inflation in these unpredictable times and the effects of vaccination in the US. Then, they will lecture about education, informality, and the Mexican labor market in the tropical forest frontiers in flux, both in the context of pandemics. Season 3 is going to be about education and the COVID-19 pandemic. And finally, our day will end with a talk about an industry application of artificial intelligence. The same dynamics as yesterday will continue with the time for discussions and a coffee break after the season. I give the floor to Dr. Aída García, our coordination of this event.
Well, thank you very much again for being here. And I think let's keep it short. We start with the presentations. And I think the first presenter is Edwin. So if you would like to come here. He is he's an advisor at the Central Bank of Mexico. And he's going to present a paper on consumers and inflation in the COVID-19 pandemic. And the person who's commenting is José Manuel Márquez. So I keep it short, so I leave you the floor. And I think the presentation is already there. So you have 20 minutes to present and then the comments.
Well, thank you so much for your attention, and it is a pleasure to be here. Today we are gonna talk about a hot topic that we are solving, and that it is inflation. So first of all, I have to say that all the comments that I'm going to take today are all of my own, and do not necessarily represent the central bank or any private institution. First, I have to say that the traditional concept of price index indicator, it is a weighted average of the price that we observe in the economy. The weights that we use to compute the price indicator are from the share that these prices represent in the consumption basket. But in the midst of the pandemic, these weights change a lot because consumers suffer some supply and demand shocks. The traditional way that we use to compute these price indicators is not the correctly that necessarily represents this huge shock that we face. So our research proposed an alternative measure to compute the price indicator using dynamic weights to compute the price indicator. We use this recalculation of these weights using the information provided by credit and debit card series. And we find that the core inflation corrected for COVID effects was found higher than the official indicator published by the National Institute of Statistics in Mexico. We follow the methodology proposed by Cavalos that apply this exercise for the US, where the classifications of credit and debit card series were attached to 8 specific classes of consumption. We try to reduce the frequency of this information that is provided in a daily frequency, making very simple transformation, calculating an average for monthly data. We also try to avoid other disturbance in our analysis, trying to discount in all seasonal effects that we can find in these types of series. Also, additional effect is that we try to capture the growth of rate of this credit and debit data series in order to input this information in the weights that were fixed in order to make a dynamic weight for the price indicator. As you can see in this graph, we find that the patterns that the early literature report for around the globe favored food merchandise in the beginning of the pandemic, and also the consumption in health and social assistance services. Other additional information that this graph provides is that all of the other complements of consumption suffer a lot and was a very high decrease in their dynamic. We try to make the closest possible match between the information of the credit and debit card series with the price indicator categories in order to make a consistent attachment of this information with the objective of construct a robust indicator of inflation that discount the effects of the COVID pandemic. As we can see in this equation, we try to input the growth of rate of the credit and debit that series into the fixed weights in order to make a dynamic weight, and also create this core CPI generic price index with the dynamic weights in order to obtain the COVID-19 underlying price indicator. Our main finding is that in the early age of the pandemic, we find a spread of 20 basis points between the official indicator and the COVID-19 alternative indicator of inflation. We can say that maybe this indicator could be an early signal of high pressure to inflation due to the demand side. We can say that this rapid and quick changes in consumer patterns are pressuring a lot the prices. Right now, if we can update this graph to our current days, and we are seeing a spread of 80 basis points between the official core indicator and the core inflation COVID-19 that we are proposing. Other stylized fact is that in the early beginning of the pandemic, we see a high share favored to food, merchandise, and also to housing and basic services. This was a transitory effect, but that affects a lot the dynamic of the price indicator, as we can see in the last graph. An obvious critic to our work is that the population that really use the credit and debit card series is very limited. But we try to make a robust exercise to give more evidence that our indicator is it is nonsense, giving some statistical evidence between the relationship of consumption series and also the low payment series system. So we applied some co-integration tests in order to provide this evidence. And as you can see in this table, we found that in the domestic market, semi-durable goods and the credit and debit card series are related in terms of trend. And also, we find that imported durable goods have a close trend in terms of this financial series. It is kind of logic because, for example, when you are going to purchase a refrigerator or a microwave or a car or stuff like that, you are going to try to use the financial system because it is a huge impact in your income disponibility. And you are going to use this kind of resources. But if the last table didn't give you a lot of information, maybe we can convince you a little bit, giving you an image of how the series are accompanied in terms of strength. Also, we have found that these financial series are related to the consumption patterns here in Mexico, and this the relationship is very close in terms of linearity. But we also are extending our results and finding that the relation it follows even on non-linearity scheme. Our main remarks is that the coronavirus make a huge impact in the consumption patterns, and that's why we need an alternative measure to capture these shocks to inflation. And we have found that the COVID-19 alternative indicator for inflation it is higher than the official core indicator. And an additional contribution to our work is that we provide an statistical evidence of our trend relationship between this financial series and the consumption private data. So that's all for me. Thank you so much for your time. It's great, and I'm open to any question that you have.
Well, we continue. I'm going to talk about this paper. I appreciate your work. Thank you very much for the organizers who give me the opportunity to be here, thinking about these ideas that we are analyzing. After I read this work, in my opinion, there are two main contributions. In the first one is that we have the technical contribution of providing us with an alternative way of measuring inflation by building an indicator that takes advantage of low payment system data published by Banxico, our central bank. Doing this, we have the advantage of using up-to-date information provided by the bank, and apparently better approximates the unconventional effects of the COVID-19 pandemic on core inflation that the official measure does. Additionally, it gave us a reliable indicator of the consumption of semi-durable and domestic goods and import durable products based on this information from Banxico. However, this indicator, by its nature, has the shortcoming of the conventional method for calculating prices. First, the precision of the measurement, and second, the commodity substitution and plutocratic biases. This can be improved by using aggregate indicators that consider changes in household consumption over time caused by variations in prices, the quality of merchandise, and consumption indicators, which are called cost of living indices. On the other hand, this work gives us the possibility to discuss the other contribution, I think, is to discuss the way we measure certain relevant economic indicators. In this case, we do in order to measure inflation. We know that conventional consumer price index has several shortcomings in addition to those already mentioned, because it considers a fixed basket of goods on this calculation. These limitations does not allow us to model changes in household consumption, even seasonal ones, because you can't change the different products that households consume in each season. And it's an interesting proposal to reduce these biases and incorporate changes in household consumption. I know the case was done for our brilliant graduate, Octavio Márquez Cano, and I participate in his thesis process. He calculated complex, used complex network theory to propose an alternative to the mechanism of selection of consumers in time applied to Mexican case. And it was a very nice work because of the dynamics that it can provide to the model. The methodology collects the various interactions between consumers and the consumption basket in a particular moment and space. Then it categorizes each element of the consumption basket based on its alternative importance. Furthermore, the hypothesis of the dynamics of the agents establishes that the involved adaptive from the interactions they had with the neighbors. That is, there is a diffusion mechanism in the graph linked to the consumers, where their consumption decision will be associated with their degree of homophily and the influence exerted by other agents belonging to the network. So we see the consumers as a network, and they have influenced each other. Then he formulates possible interaction as a bipartite network composed of a set of consumers and a consumption basket. A solution for this model is based on the centrality of the agent vector of the graph. So the method uses this graduate person, corrects the plutocratic bias of the weighting system and offers an alternative theoretical index forged by heterogeneous agents with limited rationality who interact locally and co-involve. So my suggestion for this future work, for the work that you do, is continue to taking advantage of the information generated by the Banxico, the central bank, because this is very important to find useful applications for this reliable and opportunity information. I think it's a very, very nice contribution that you do. And the other one is to combine new tools of analysis that can enhance and improve the theoretical framework you use. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Good morning. I'm happy to present our next speaker. Dr. Armando Sánchez Vargas from the Institute of Economic Research is going to talk about assessing the effect to the USA vaccination program on the positive rate. Today we have 4 sessions. This is our first. At the end of the presentations, we will have time for questions. I beg you to be short and speak in English, please. For those who are watching us by YouTube, you can write down your questions in English in the chat. And for people here, just please raise your hand and wait for the microphone. Le ruego a cabina tener listo un micrófono para el público que haga preguntas. Doctor Armando Sánchez.
Good morning, everyone. Well, I'm going to present a model about the effect of the vaccination program on the COVID positivity rate. I choose this name as a multivariate approach because we are trying to include into the model as many variables as possible, so that we can avoid any significant biases derived from omitted variables into the model. And we also try to consider the potential simultaneity between the vaccination and the positivity rate. So what we are in general trying to do is to avoid the biases resulting from the endogeneity problems, and at the same time, by including too many variables with a large database, we can ensure that our results are more reliable in a statistical sense. So my presentation is divided in the next sections. First, I will show the research question, then the hypothesis. I will show a little bit of the background used, because there were. ¿No están viendo?
No.
Okay. Okay, so my presentation will be divided in the next sections. First, I will present the research question and the hypothesis about the determinants of the COVID positivity rate. This is for the United States. I present also the literature, which is stated as background, the methodology I use, the econometric methodology, and we also use some methods of machine learning methods. Then we discuss the results. What was the research question we planned for this paper? The main question was, what has been the effect of the US vaccination program on the spread of the SARS-CoV-2 virus? There are a lot of papers about the determinants of the COVID positivity rate, deaths, hospitality rates, and so on. In this case, I am interested in responding this question for the positivity rate and the impact of the US vaccination program on that rate. So I didn't find a lot of papers doing that, assessing the effect of the vaccination program. So that was the question, to assess the impact of the vaccination program on the positivity rate. But also another interesting question is what has been the combined effect of other factors such as mobility, temperature, humidity, geography, public policy on the transmission of the virus. Most of the papers that I could find, they work with some factors, but not too many. And we know that a model that does not include them can face the problem of omitted bias, omitted variables. And at the same time, the hypothesis is that the COVID positivity rate increases because there is some kind of combined effects, not only of the vaccination program, but also from these other exogenous variables, because some of them are really exogenous. For example, the humidity and temperature can be considered exogenous variables. Some others, like the public policy, are exogenous, but maybe not so much, because the government try to implement a higher rate of vaccination in order to stop the virus. So I consider that the public policy program could also be endogenous. Okay, what is the hypothesis then? The vaccine has been effective, we all know that, but we need to estimate the impact. However, it has a differentiate impact and can be offset by other negative factors, such as climate, mobility, and human behavior. I think, in fact, that human behavior is the second most important factor in driving the positivity rate in the United States. There are also other negative externalities that, combined with the vaccine, affect the vaccine's performance. What I mean with this, suppose that the impact of the vaccination program is of this size, right? Then if you don't take into account the negative impacts that may reduce the impact of the vaccination program, you are not estimating the precise effect of the vaccination program, because it's not only that the vaccination reduces the positivity rate, but there are other compensating factors that are offsetting the positive impact of the vaccination program. So that if we want to assess the real impact of any vaccination program, not only the one of the United States, you need to take into account the rest of the factors and the combination among them. At the same time, you need to have a lot of data, a large database, and consider as many variables as possible to do this kind of evaluation. Because at the end, we are working like an assessment of a program, because this is a public policy program. Okay, the background. There are a lot of papers, but some of them are, for example, indicating that the positivity rate is a good indicator to measure the spread of COVID-19 disease. That's why I selected to use this positivity rate. Then another finding in the literature is there is a strong relationship between vaccination programs and the number of COVID-19 infections. So most of us believe that the vaccination program has a positive impact. Some other papers said that there was a positive relationship between COVID-19 incidence and mobility. And this literature has found a really big impact of mobility on the positivity rate. So the people moves and the number of contagions increase. Background. Other finding important in the literature is there is a mixed result on the effect of temperature and humidity on the number of COVID-19 cases. There are some papers believe that the temperature has a positive impact in the number of infections, but some others do not find a significant association between those two variables, infections and temperature. So there is like a kind of mixed results in the literature. On the other hand, some factors such as restrictions on population mobility, social distancing measures, and confined requirements led to fewer infections. This was another finding of the literature. This is a little bit of the ideas that you can find in the literature. So that I wanted to increase to estimate this big model. So the methodology we use, it was a co-integrated simultaneous equation system, co-integrated simultaneous equation system, in which I cannot put a lot of variables, but I can control for the simultaneity between the variables in this three equation system. And then I also estimated the same models, co-integrated models, but using what is called a vector error correction model, that is a panel data model. So what I was doing, it was following for the different states of the 52 states of the United States, we were following this information over time, weekly, so that we can have a large database, more than almost 3,000 observations. And that gave me enough degrees of freedom to include many variables, and even to try some machine learning techniques to select the statistical significant regressors or explanatory variables into the model, the ones that are really explaining the COVID positivity rate. So I use these machine learning techniques. Although we estimate the models in a general model, including all the variables, and then another in which I only introduce in the model the factors selected by using machine learning techniques. This was done as a let's say, as a sensitivity analysis to check if the results were robust to the inclusion of new variables, to the change of statistical methods, and to the inclusion of different specifications of the model, and even changing the type of data, because the first model was a time series and the second model was a panel data model. As I say, we had three equations. This implies that we have three endogenous variables: the positivity rate, the mobility, and I hypothesize that the doses were also endogenous. So, and the determinants were, I used the same set of determinants for all the variables, and then we selected the significant ones by using these machine learning techniques. Okay, the equations, this is for the time series model, and this is the same equations, but for the panel co-integrated model. The data. We use weekly data from December 2020 to June 2022. The main information was extracted from the Center for Disease Control and Prevention of the United States, the CDC. Some of the variables are the 7-day moving average positivity rate, the number of doses administered, the mobility index, public policy variables reported by the CDC. We also use, for the climatic variables, we use the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration database, NOAA. From it, we extracted the average temperature, average relative humidity, and the rainfall. From the U.S. Department of Labor, Employment, and Training Administration, we extracted the unemployment insurance. Okay, we also added a large set of variables I can share with you if you are interested. But at least we had like we included like 54 variables in each model of the panel data model to control for all the possible or potential factors affecting the positivity rate among the population in the United States at the state level. So we are talking about the state level, not individual level. Okay. Well, results about the co-integrated system of equations with time series data. We have a first exercise. This is the so-called variance decomposition analysis. We found that if we have a lot of results, but I'm just presenting the most important ones. So the positivity in the first week, when there is a shock in COVID, the positivity rate increases in the first week 100%. Then it starts decreasing till week 10. What does this mean, the positivity rate? It means that previous infections had to do with current infections. So this confirms the dynamics of the behavior of the virus. Then mobility. The mobility has a good an impact. It reaches almost 5.9% at the 10-week period. But we can see how the doses or the vaccination program reaches a 30.87%. Explains that percent of the variance of the forecast error. So it shows that the vaccination program, in fact, has a really good impact in reducing the number of people affected by the virus, by the virus. The mean temperature and mean humidity play a role also, but it's not so big as the impact of the vaccination program. But if we add the impacts of mobility, and temperature and humidity, they have some weight. Let's see the impulse responses. Here we have the impact of the positivity rate. How is it affected by a shock in the positivity rate? That means how the positivity rate affects itself. So this has to do with the dynamics of the virus. There is some kind of persistence, right? This persistence, the shock starts at week 1, and then by week 7, that means almost 2 months, there is this persistence, no? And then it decays. Then the impact of the vaccination program has a good impact when the government decides to provide the vaccination to the people. Then it starts, and then it reaches its, let's say, it starts reducing the positivity rate, but it reaches its maximum point by the 6th week, and then the effect of the vaccination starts getting back to its to the level, to 0 point, right? Then the population mobility index, it has a positive impact on the positivity rate, and it does not decay very early. It has a long impact even at week 10. So that is consistent with previous results in the literature. Then impulse response for the positivity rate to average temperature. Also, the temperature has a negative impact. Although in the literature, there is this evidence that maybe yes, maybe no. There is a mixed result. The average relative humidity has a first negative impact and then a positive impact. So they, in this simultaneous equation model, it's a mixed result also. Discussion. Let me show you them. We perform the cointegration analysis using also the cointegrated system. We found the same results, but this model included more than 54 variables. The results of the time series model were consistent, so we can say that we find a robust results about these responses were more or less confirmed by the panel data model. Discussion. We first found that the positivity rate is negatively associated with the US vaccination program, which confirms that it has a positive effect, and the average temperature and relative humidity. An increase in the positivity rate seems to be associated with a higher level of population mobility. Then the vaccines given to people affect the positivity rate through two channels, and that can be confirmed in the equations that I showed before. A greater number of doses reduce the positivity rate. By a higher number of doses, increase also mobility. So there are like counteracting effects. So they are the different effects are offsetting themselves. You know, the vaccination programs help to reduce the positivity rate, but at the same time, the vaccination program makes the people feel comfortable to live to the streets, and that mobility increases at the same time the positivity rate. So there is this kind of counteracting effects that offset themselves, and these effects are like reducing the impact of the US vaccination program. So what we can say is that it would be important that the governments in every country take into account the different factors affecting the positivity rate. It's not only that if we vaccinate, we are going to have a successful result of the public policy program. No, they must also understand that other public policies, health public policies, are also playing an important role. And these are associated to mobility, to the use of a mask, for example. There are countries that are not using it. I want to add here that in any model, in no model, we found the mask use to be significant, statistically significant in any model in the United States. So the mask use was not statistically significant. I couldn't explain that to myself because I said, well, the mask use is important. So I asked that to a physician, and she told me that the mask was not used in the United States. So why it must be significant if it was not used? So it's not going to have any effect because the United States government didn't pay attention to that kind of public policy that is also important. So, you know, I think that it's a combination. It's also an empirical issue because every country must be different. So every country must use different factors, understand them, and plan ahead in order to have a well-prepared public policy, general public policy, to face future problems that we are going to have with new viruses or even variants of the coronavirus. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Doctor. Now we will hear the discussant Professor Christopher Martin from the University of Bath. Professor, you have 15 minutes.
Okay, I won't use 15 minutes, but thank you. That was really interesting. Thank you. Somebody very wise once said to me that the way you measure good research is not through the journal you publish it in or anything like that. It's in terms of the interest it generates and the questions it generates. So I've got a lot of questions. So this is very good research, and I think that comment was absolutely right. I guess my first comment is to have read the literature on this topic is a very impressive achievement. The medical, the epidemiological, the statistical literature here is absolutely enormous. So the kind of sheer act of scholarship, I'm very impressed. That's terrific. I also think that with an issue of this importance, it is essential to approach it with as many different perspectives as possible. And so while someone who's an epidemiologist might think, why would you use a VECM model? I think it's exactly the right thing to do because we all come to this with our different perspectives. And I think every statistical approach has got value in that respect. So I think that's great. One question I had immediately was in terms of your focus on the positivity rate. I can absolutely understand why that's important, but I guess there are other dimensions as well. I'm not as well informed as I should be on the specific vaccines that we used in the US. I guess it was mainly Moderna, possibly. I don't really, and I think in the US you use somewhat different vaccines to the UK, so I'm a little ignorant about that. But at least the vaccines I'm aware of, they were extremely effective in reducing severe illness and hospitalizations, and somewhat less effective in reducing positive infections, positivity. So I guess one question is, would you find the same results if you were to look at, say, hospitalizations as a measure of severe illness, as opposed to positivity? That would be an interesting thing to look at. I was interested in your choice of using a VECM model, a configuration-based model. I don't disagree particularly with you doing it, but I wonder why you chose to do it rather than, for example, say a structural VAR or something like that. So I wonder what you gained from the configuration aspect to it. There may have been something, but my first instinct would be, for example, to try a structural VAR and see what came out of that. So I'd be interested in that. Another thing which occurred to me was that during the pandemic, we were all learning all the time about how to respond to this disease. So although it's difficult to incorporate some way of allowing behavior to adapt to changing information might be interesting. So clearly time varying parameter models are difficult. I'm not particularly sure if you even can do them in a VAR context, but something around how behavior adapted to the kind of emerging threat, and also to how behavior adapted once the benefits of the vaccine became apparent, I think would be interesting. Something I missed slightly was that the time period that we're using, but my impression is that there was a period, you've got a period before the vaccine and a period after the vaccine. So I'm interested in what the impact of things like mobility and humidity were before the vaccine. Because clearly once the vaccine came along, it was having this enormous and very welcome effect. I wonder if we can see more about the impact of mobility and humidity prior to the vaccine coming along. The other thing which occurred to me is that when you read the economic kind of theoretical contributions around the pandemic, a lot of them are based around seen through the lens of what are called SIR models. I'm sure you know these better than me. Susceptible, infected, recovered models. And what those models put quite a lot of emphasis on is the proportion of the population who are infected, or more specifically not infected. Those, I guess, are the susceptible population, and the proportion who are recovered. So you may very well have included them in your list of explanatory variables, and I'd be interested to see what the effect of those were. And then also thinking about this from a public health perspective, thinking about Ramsey's interesting talk yesterday. Clearly there's a public health issue in the US as well as Mexico and the UK, And it strikes me that there are variations across states in the severity of this public health issues. You know, the degree of unhealthiness in Americans, maybe this is a cliche, but seems to be higher in some states than others. Americans seem, from my impression, seem to be sicker in Florida than they are in New York, for example. And I'd be interested to see what the effects were that you had from that. And then my final question is coming back to the literature, which is very kind of comprehensive, very detailed literature. You have an estimate of the impact of the vaccination on positivity. And I'm interested in knowing how that differs or how that compares to the lab-based evidence. Lab-based evidence clearly shows the kind of clinical effectiveness of the vaccine. But once the vaccine goes out into the wild, into the field, obviously lots more things come into play. So I'd be interested to see how your data-driven, population-driven evidence differs from the kind of experimental lab-based evidence. I think that would be fascinating. So, as I say, good research prompts lots of questions, and I had lots of questions. So, thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Christopher Martin. Now we can hear your questions. Do we have any questions?
Thank you. So I have a couple of questions for Edwin and also for Armando. So the question for Edwin, and thank you very much for the presentation. It's really interesting. So my question is, why did you go for co-integration? It seems to me like you are analyzing the COVID pandemic, and co-integration is for a long-run relationship. So is it like you are arguing that there is like a new trend or a new long-run, line in there in terms of the inflation? That's the first. And the second is, do you think that a new CPI index could be valid only for the period of the pandemic, or is it more like we should be using it for other periods because probably it has more value added and more dynamic? So those are the questions. And for Armando also, thank you very much for the presentation. And I was thinking on the data of COVID seems to me to have like a funny distribution, right? And so have you thought about the structural breaks? Because there are some people that are accounting for structural breaks on when they talk to COVID data. And so if you have included that, or what you could comment on that. And the other thing is, could you expand on the reasons that a vaccination program is endogenous? I could get an idea, but exactly what are you thinking of by putting that? Because usually we put like government programs as exogenous, right? And probably the third question is that you talked at the beginning about behavioral conduct. And you mentioned that you have this large set of variables that you included to control the omitted omitted variables. So could you mention what are the variables that you use? And thank you.
Thank you. Do you want to start, please?
Thank you so much for the question. First, we apply the co-integration analysis because we try to avoid the critic that the problem of the financial inclusion here in Mexico, it makes no sense for our alternative inflation indicator. So we try to provide evidence that the financial series and the consumption private series have a common trend. At the moment of our research, we didn't have a lot of periods to try to apply a co-integration analysis that is robust to structural breaks, such as the Gregory-Hansen framework. So we applied the traditional co-integrations and we found a statistical and robust evidence of that this series have a dynamic trend that is common. The second question was to what have to do with this alternative indicator. We think that our alternative indicator add to the policy decision, but it is not a substitution of the official indicator, because we don't have the complete certainty that our indicator provides a good reading of the price dynamic on the stress situation. So we think that it is a complementary indicator, and it's not necessary substitute the official one.
Thank you, Master Salim. Dr. Armando, please.
So, thank you, Chris, for the remarkable comments. They were really good. So, regarding the why did I use a vector error correction model and in the two flavors, time series and panel data, is that the data, if you graph the data, it's obvious that the data are not stationary over the weeks. So that's the main reason. So after that, well, the methodology suggests that we must test for cointegration, test for unit roots in the time series model, and in the vector error correction model is not needed because we are using some kind of ADL models developed by Pesaran, and it's not needed that the series are of the same degree of cointegration of the same number of unit roots. Okay, now we were trying different specifications so that we can make a difference between short and long run effects, as Aída is saying now. Is there really a long run relationship between the variables? That was the question. So we were trying different specifications so to find, for example, if we put in the cointegration section, in the long run cointegration structure of the model, we put, for example, the ban restrictions of going to bars or going to restaurants. There was definitely a long run relationship between the positivity rate and going to a restaurant. No relationship in the long run. But if we put the vaccine against the positivity rate, there was a robust long run relationship because it appeared in every specification we put. Even we use time series data or we use panel data, we change the number of lags, we change. At the end of the day, we included more than 100 variables because we use it like all the public policy variables that the CDC reports. There are too many if you want to look at that website. And then we included the lags of those variables. There were many specifications. It was a really hard work in terms of working with the data. Another interesting comment from Chris, it was this about the heterogeneity between the states among the states in the United States. Yeah, if you obtain the model for each state, they are different, and you can find a state like, for example, let's think about Louisiana, where the vaccine has a lower impact, where most of the public policies are not significant. And there are other states like California, where even the cointegrating equations change, the coefficients are greater, the statistical significance of some variables differ. But at the end of the day, the test suggested the existence of homogeneous long-run relationships among states, so that you can say that there is just one long-run relationship for the entire country. That is a common test performed in co-integrated panel models. It is called the Hausmann test. We use it, and we found that although there are states with heterogeneous responses, in general, you can see that there is just one long-run relationship for all the United States, so that that you can have some kind of general response to all the variables, and then we use that. But the heterogeneity is captured in the short-run part of the model, where we computed 54 equations, one for each state, but only in the short run. In the long run, we have just one equation, but 54 equations, 52 equations, one for each state we included in the database. So yeah, and these kind of methods also allow us to control the heterogeneity, because we are using an estimator similar to the within estimator, where you cancel the fixed effects, right? So let's say the bias that can arise from the heterogeneity among states is like canceled. They're not observable. The observable, we try to control that by including as many variables as possible in the model. The heterogeneity given by observables. The heterogeneity given by non-observables is controlled by the estimation, the estimator we use. Then, yeah, this question, it was really good. That's about the comparison between the clinic effect of the vaccine and the one performed with observational data that we have. It was non-experimental. So we were like reading also that literature. I think it's not so, we cannot compare exactly. Both say that the vaccine was having a positive impact in reducing the positivity rate, but they are not so we cannot compare them because they are really different experiments. So we didn't emphasize too much about that. I'm going to think about it. It's a good question. That is the thing. There are also some mathematical experiments, not only experiments performed with clinic data and with observational data as we did it. There are also experiments run through agent-based models, mathematical simulations on how the virus behaves. So that is important also, and there is a lot of this kind of evidence. Simulations, let's say. Regarding Aída's questions, the structural breaks, I performed the test, unit root test with the structural change, and we didn't find any. So that's why. It's just almost some months of data, and we didn't find it. The vaccination program is endogenous, the preferences. This is a behavior. We economists like to think about that the data is also associated to behavior. In fact, there is an underlying model of behavior behind what we see on the data, right? So behavior, how did I control for behavior here, or why I think that the vaccination program is endogenous? If it is an exogenous intervention, we are used to think about it. No, every police shock is exogenous by nature. It should be, but in this case, I found by estimating the models 1,000 of times, let's say, we found that some kind of endogeneity of the vaccination program by performing the test. Then we must relate that to behavior of the people that adopt the vaccination. And I explain this thinking that the government has a not observable preference over vaccination. That means the people also has it, because there is people that is reluctant to take the vaccination, and that is not observable, right? I can say that the vaccination, I don't want to take the vaccine because it's bad or something. So that is not observable, but it's not also observable the preferences of the government on the vaccine, because there is, for example, the Kentucky government didn't want to take the vaccine. California's government was applying the vaccine in a massive scale. So, but these preferences on the vaccination, you can control them by including maybe geographical dummy variables into the model, but it's not clear or it's not precise. But if you use an estimator that helps you to control this heterogeneity by canceling them, that is one way of approaching this. So that's why I did that. So the preferences of the vaccination. In fact, there are many papers working on, look, they call hesitant people to take the vaccination, but it's not observable. There are models, in fact, performing surveys on the people. They interview people and about if they are reluctant to take the vaccine or not, and they try to control for that factor. In this case, since we are dealing with time series over time, time series data over time, we can control by using this estimator. It's not so precise, but at least I can say that some of the observables that do not change over time, that do not vary over time, are controlled in the model. So that's why I say that there is a behavior on this. Let's say that there is like a microeconomic behavior of the people in this. I am kind of obsessed about relating the statistical assumptions, relate them to microeconomic assumptions, because there must be a hard model behind the other thing. In fact, I think that the data mining works that we have seen, we must make efforts to relate them to the theory, because the empirical stuff can be helpful, show patterns, show stylized facts, but in the end, there must be a behavioral pattern that must be captured by an economic model, a psychological model, a sociological model, some kind of theory behind, no, underlying the facts. So that's what I can say about them. Thank you very much. It was a really good feedback.
Thank you, Doctor. Any other question? Yes, please.
Thanks for that. That was really interesting. I have another question for Armando. It's a follow-up to this behavior change that you're mentioning. And I think it really complements with the presentation yesterday by Ramses to do with more with the pre-existing factors that affect the response to the disease, but you're complemented with the behavioral aspects of it once the vaccine has been taken. And I wonder whether these factors, I mean, what is the extent of the overlap between these factors? I'm guessing that youth, more healthy individuals behave differently after the vaccine because they consider themselves less at risk once the vaccine has been taken. So do you have any insight on this kind of interaction between the factors before that affect your success rate once you take the vaccine and the factors that influence your behavior once you take the vaccine? Do you have an insight on that? Thanks.
Thank you. Another one? Then Dr. Armando, please.
Yes, really good, interesting question, Santiago. Really good. I think that, yeah, because there were like at least 3 rounds of the vaccination over time. So we have a variable that controls that. you see one variable. We introduced one variable that it says that the time of the first round of the vaccination program then ended up, and then the second time, the third time. So we control for the 3 exact periods of that during our time span. So that was the way to control that into the model. So we try to find all the details so that we can control them in the model, so we can be as much as possible sure of the results, the statistical results. So thank you. It gave me some question to think about this, because I can still think about it.
Thank you, Dr. Armando. Dr. Christopher Martin, do you want to add something? Okay, any other question? Well, thank you so much to everybody. We will have coffee break, and we will be back at 11 o'clock. Thank you. Welcome back to the session 2, named The Labor Market and COVID-19 Pandemic Part 2. In this session, Dr. Magdaleno Colo from the Department of Economics at the University of Bath will talk to us about education, informality in the Mexican labor market. Dr. Colo, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Thank you. In the next 15-ish minutes, I will talk you through a paper I have written with Aída and Chris, my friends and colleagues from University of Bath, on the unequal impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic on the Mexican labor market. I'll just start by saying that this is going to be, it's a really long paper. So what I'm going to present to you would be a very short version of what we've done. So if you're interested in the details, please have a look at any of our profiles on the university webpage, and you will have access to the paper and the appendix. So before I begin, I thought to just say that I feel a bit like a fish out of water. I was talking with my colleagues a few days ago about how I'm a Nigerian living in the United Kingdom, working in the United Kingdom, here in Mexico, talking to Mexicans about the Mexican labor market. So I am more than a little anxious, but I guess that's why I'm here. That's why we're here, to for an opportunity to see in person myself the things that we have observed in the data, and for an opportunity to discuss our new and existing research interests with like-minded people. And yes, so thank you very much to the university and to the organizers of this session, and thank you for your interest in our work. So in the coming minutes, I will talk you through our research motivation. I will spend most of my time on the data because I think that's the most interesting part of the paper. I'll run you through the model because you can see most of the model in the paper and the appendix, and then we'll talk about shocks, and I'll show you the results, and hopefully end in time. So how did we set about, or what brought us to studying the impact of the pandemic on the Mexican labor market? At the start of the pandemic, we had written a paper on the differing impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic on the UK labor market. We looked at the impact on graduates and non-graduates in high-skill occupations and low-skill occupations. And after that, we thought, what other kinds of heterogeneity in the labor market can we reflect? And then we thought another really good and obvious heterogeneity is informality. There's lots of countries with large, thriving informal sectors. So we thought it's the next step, a natural next step. And then why did we choose Mexico? Well, first, Aída is our friend, so anything about Mexico will be interesting to us. But more importantly, there's lots of countries with thriving large informal sectors, and which are susceptible to lots of external shocks. So Mexico represents, or what we have done with Mexico can be extended to reflect the sort of impact the COVID-19 pandemic had on other similar economies. So the pandemic had a severe impact on economies around the world, including Mexico. But in particular, underlying that general impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on the labor market, in the Mexican labor market, what we could observe from the data was that there was a larger impact. The impact was more severe for non-graduates and workers in the informal sector. So going forward, I will, where possible, tell you about the data before the pandemic and during the pandemic. So we'll be looking at before and the during. So looking at the data before the pandemic, what we observed was most employed graduates had formal jobs, but then there were some graduates who also had informal jobs. And then there were mostly employed non-graduates in informal jobs, although there was quite a few, or a smaller percentage of non-graduates who had formal jobs as well. But also another thing to be observed is a lot of movement in the labor market between formal and informal sectors and from in and out of employment. Now, during the pandemic, yes, there was a high amount of job loss across board for both formal and informal workers, graduates and non-graduates. But what was striking was that the impact was worse for non-graduates and informal workers. So that triggered our curiosity and investigation. So, how do we conceptualize this this more severe impact on non-graduates and informal workers due to the pandemic? There are two broad ways to look at things. You could say, okay, the pandemic, or there was a larger shock to non-graduates and to non-graduates and informal workers than there was to graduates and formal workers, and we classify that as the severe. We call that the severe impact. Let's find out. Thank you. So you could assume that the shocks were larger. The shocks due to the pandemic were larger for informal workers and graduates, and that's a fair way to look at things. But then, how about if the shocks to all workers, formal and informal, graduates and non-graduates, were the same size, but because of the factors associated with non-graduates and informal workers, who were naturally, by virtue of their employment and their education status, in a weaker, disadvantaged position compared to graduates and formal workers, the impact of the same size of shock due to the pandemic would have been worse for those workers. That we call the same shocks hypothesis. And what we find the evidence supporting is the same size hypothesis. And what we argue is driving this same size hypothesis of same size shocks, but worse for non-graduates and informal workers, is their employment status and their employment outlook by virtue of their education. What we argue is that the job non-graduates and informal workers are more likely to be in job matches that have a smaller match surplus. And because that match surplus is smaller, in the pre-pandemic time, that is reflected in short job tenures for such workers, and the higher probability of job destruction and their transition from employment into non-employment. And then all that happened during the pandemic is that the COVID-19 pandemic just exacerbated that, made that worse. So what we argue and what we argue that the data says is that all workers were hit by the same size shock, but because some workers were in a worse off position before the pandemic, when the pandemic hit, the impact was much worse. So how did we put this all together? What we did to further our argument was to set up a DSG model with labor market search, reflect graduates and non-graduates, as we've seen in data, the formal and informal sector, as we've seen in data, and then model in shocks that mimic the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. We end up with a really long, large model, which I also would argue is an interesting model. And we show that our model is able to match the impact of the pandemic on output and employment. So let me talk about now the data. We would, as I said earlier, we would look at the pre-pandemic period and during the pandemic. We use the NOE data, and then we classify workers into two employment statuses, employed or non-employed. We bunch the unemployed, the available, and the non-available into one group because we noticed a lot of transition between all unemployed, available, and non-employed, and transition from that bunched group into employment. So we've got two categories of employment statuses, employed and non-employed. Next, we define informality. What's an informal job? An informal job is a job offered by an employer that is invisible to the tax authorities, that evades labor market regulations, and does not offer permanent employment or social security benefits to its workers. So I'll just skip to the diagram because I think that will be easier to describe the pattern we observed in the pre-pandemic Mexican labor market. So first, we see that we've got the labor market in Mexico before the pandemic. We've got about 12% of the labor force being graduates in formal jobs. But we also see that there's a small percentage of graduates in informal jobs. Next, we see that there's quite a significant proportion of the labor market consisting of non-graduates in informal jobs, much larger than what we have for graduates. And we see a really small percentage of non-graduates in informal jobs. Next, we see a really huge percentage of the Mexican labor market being non-employed graduates, and comparing that to the a really large percentage of the Mexican labor market being non-employed non-graduates, and a significantly smaller percentage of non-employed graduates. So that's the obvious part. But then what else can we notice from this chart? What we see is a pattern emerging. We see that the largest proportion of the Mexican labor market in the pre-pandemic period is made up of non-employed non-graduates. But next, the next largest proportion is that of non-graduates in informal jobs. I think that will come to play in the coming slides. So now to transitions. What do we observe with transitions? Okay, first, before that, how did we calculate transitions? We took, for the pre-pandemic period, we looked at the NOE data of 2018, second quarter 2018 to 2019 fourth quarter. And what we did was to drop first the respondents that were not present in all quarters, and then we tracked respondents from quarter to quarter and took an average from across all the quarters. So what we report here is the quarter-to-quarter average of worker transitions. So what we see first is graduates in formal jobs have a high percentage of remaining in formal jobs, and it's slightly less for graduates in informal jobs. Comparing that to the non-graduates in formal firms compared to non-graduates in informal firms, the rate of transition is a bit more balanced than what we see with graduates. But next, we see that there seems to be a type of job ladder. The transition rate of graduates from informal firms to formal firms is significantly larger than the transition from non-employment into formal firms. And we see the same pattern, although to a lesser extent for non-graduates. So there seems to be like a hierarchy of employment where those in informal firms are more likely to enter formal firms than those who are in non-employment. And finally, let's just skip this and go all the way to job loss. We see that consistently graduates have a lesser rate of transition into non-employment than non-graduates. So non-graduates are more likely to transition from employment of any kind into non-employment and are more likely to remain in unemployment or non-employment than graduates. So that pattern we talked about earlier is still being maintained throughout the transitions. So something else to mention before I proceed to the data on the pandemic is the NOE was not conducted in the second quarter of 2020 because the pandemic just began, and it was replaced with the telephone survey. But then the telephone survey was not compatible with the NOE data, so we skipped that quarter. So when we look at transitions in the coming slide, we'll be looking at transitions from the first quarter of 2020 to the third quarter of 2020, and then from the third quarter to the fourth quarter. You'll see what I mean shortly. So I'll just skip this and use this rather elegant figure to explain the transitions during the pandemic. So what's the first thing we observe? We see quite a lot of job loss for both graduates and non-graduates transitioning into non-employment, and the employment level falling for all categories of workers. But what do we also see? that there's more transition into non-employment for non-graduates. So that pattern still persists into the pandemic. What next? We find employment falling for all categories of workers, but what we see is that the fall in employment for graduates in formal and informal jobs is quite even. But taking a look at the case for non-graduates, we find that there's a larger difference between the fall in employment for non-graduates between formal and informal jobs and the fall in non-graduate informal jobs being the largest. Now, for the transition from the third quarter to the fourth quarter towards the end of 2020, we see non-employment falling and employment recovering. But another pattern here, the reduction in non-employment is much larger for non-graduates. And the recovery in employment is much larger for non-graduates in informal employment, and followed by graduates in informal jobs as well. And the formal sector for both graduates and non-graduates recovering much slower. So taking a look at the literature, what is special about all that we've done? How is our paper different from all the rest? There's quite a lot in the literature on heterogeneity and formal and informal sectors in Mexico. There's, I think, the Restrepo and Echevarria, there's the Urrutia paper, and so forth. There's many of these papers modeling heterogeneity, but quite often it's the case that they would assume one type of worker, or assume there's search frictions in one and not the other, and so forth. What is special about our paper is we follow the data as closely as possible. We model graduates and non-graduates, formal and informal workers, and in addition to that, we use a rich combination of shocks that describe the pandemic in a lot more detail. So all of what we've done has been to the best possible extent reflected by the data. So as I just mentioned, yes, we have graduates and non-graduates. Oh, I'll just say that here. It's easier to describe here. So all that this chart shows is our labor market, movement of graduates from non-employment into formal and informal employment, and movement between formal and informal employment for graduates, and the same for non-graduates. All of this amounts to 12 distinct labor market transitions. For firms, for the DSG part of our model, we have, I'll just use the diagram as well. We've got formal firms with graduates and non-graduates, as well as informal firms with graduates and non-graduates. Wholesale, informal and formal firms produce intermediate wholesale goods, which they sell to the formal wholesale firms, sell intermediate formal goods to formal retail firms, and the same applies to the informal sector. And both retail, formal and informal, sell finished goods to the household. So that's just a summary of the economy. More of this you would see in the paper. And then we assume that the firms negotiate, or the wage is determined by Nash bargaining, and there's Nash bargaining between the firm and each type of worker, which gives us 4 distinct wage equations. Now, we then linearize our model, calibrate the steady state using the pre-pandemic data, using all the data we described with the tables and the charts earlier on, and set up deterministic shocks to mimic the impact of the pandemic. I'll talk more about the shocks shortly. So we assume that the pandemic shocks hit in the second quarter of 2020, and then decays from there onwards. And then we simulate our model and compare our results, the results of our simulations, to the actual data, just to see how well to test our theory of same shock size and our ability of the ability of the model to reflect the data. So for shocks, we've got productivity shocks. We assume that productivity across the formal and informal sector falls by 12%. This is to reflect the reduced ability of workers to go to work and those working from home as well. We also model the impact of the actions of the Bank of Mexico reducing the policy rate to a total of about 300 basis points. We also assume a shift, a fall in the demand for informal goods, and or a shift in the demand for informal goods to formal goods by 5% to reflect the closure or the inability of most informal firms to conduct their business because of restricted movement. We also assume that aggregate demand fell by 9.5%. In addition to that, we assume that a job destruction shock of 60%. Now, something I should mention before we go on to the results is our focus on the size of the shock is not the primary, or wasn't the primary purpose of this paper. What we try to show with our paper doesn't depend entirely or much on the size of the shock. What we are trying to show is that the same shock size applied to all types of worker would give the result that we're looking for. So we're not looking at how big or how small the shock is. What we're interested in is the same size of shock applied to all types of workers in both formal and informal firms, and to see how well the model does compared to the results. So looking at the surpluses, we thought first to remember our first point. What we said was non-graduates and workers in the informal sector were in a more vulnerable position without or before the pandemic. And that was because these workers, non-graduates and informal workers, were in jobs that were likely to have smaller surpluses. And because of those small surpluses, those jobs were likely to break down and those workers were more likely to transition into non-employment. So I thought to show you the steady state results of our model. And what we see here is that the largest job match surplus comes from graduates in formal firms. And the surpluses decline as we go down, and the least surplus is from matches of non-graduates in informal firms, which highlights or re-emphasizes that pattern we talked about of non-graduates in informal jobs being the most vulnerable to shocks, or being most vulnerable with or without shocks in the labor market. So that answers the first part of our research question. The next part of our research question was, how well does our DSG model with such frictions explain or reflect the impact of the pandemic on the Mexican labor market? So we compare the results, our simulation results, to the actual. What you see in the dotted lines are the actual values, and what you see in the straight lines are our simulation results. And it's clear that our simulation result quite well matches the fall and recovery in output, and quite well also reflects the fall in non-graduate employment and graduate employment, and the same thing for the formal and informal employment. So what can we say? We can say first that we can show that, or we can, well, argue with our model that non-graduates and informal workers were in a weaker employment position before the pandemic. And with the same size shocks, our model can show that it matches the data, which confirms that with the same size shocks, non-graduates and informal workers were worse off, which agrees with the data. Next, what else can we show? We show that our simple, well, not simple, but our standard simple model is able to reflect the complex activities or the complex processes that went through the labor market in Mexico during the pandemic. And in addition to that, thank you. And our results can also be reflected or applied to models similar, or economies and labor markets similar to the Mexican economy. So if I quickly just, that's pretty much it. I also, what else have we not added? I think in as much as our results are good, our results emphasize the points that answer our research questions clearly. Things we have not included in this model are, we assumed that there were no permanent impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic on the labor market and the Mexican economy in general. We also have assumed a closed economy, and we know that Mexico is a huge exporting country, especially to the United States. So we did not reflect that, and we also did not reflect the impact in the importance of oil to the Mexican economy. And yeah, I think I'll stop there. And any other questions you have, you would find more detail in the paper, and I'd be happy to answer any questions you've got. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ocolo. Now we will hear the discussant, Dr. Moritz Cruz from the Institute for Economic Research. Doctor.
Thank you. Good morning. It is always nice to have the chance to look at a paper that analyzes the labor market, in this case, in a complex scenario like the pandemic or the crisis of 2020. And this paper, I found it quite interesting, well done in general terms. I think it achieves its aim. But for me, it's not clear some areas. So more than say again what you said, I would like to question about the paper. Well, one of the things that we learned from previous crises, especially like the Great Recession, is that the labor market behaves in a different way, like Keynes said. However, in your paper, you use, or I assume you construct the labor market like in a very conventional way. So why did you take into account like a more like a Keynes vision? As you want. Then? Okay. This is one of the questions that I have. The other one is, this crisis was, the behavior of the labor market in the Mexican economy was very different than one would expect, particularly the informal sector. Because in theory, what would you expect is that once the crisis started, there was an increase in the informality. However, at the end of the year, informality reduces. So this behavior doesn't match the theory. So why you don't take into account this, which I think is a very particular feature of the Mexican economy. In this case, I mean, one will expect an increase in unemployment, an increase on informality, an increase on poverty as a result. But this, or at least informality, didn't increase. So your results said that this same shock theory holds. I believe that this is the case. So it says like all the workers were equally affected by the shock. Okay. Well, this is what I understood by the presentation. So one will expect that at the end, both formal and informal unemployment or employment recover, but this is what the case. So I don't know if you would take into account this. I don't know why. What do you mean by a small surplus in the in your paper, no, by the firms? It's not clear to me. What do you mean by that, and why is relevant small surplus? The other thing that for me is not clear is why you assume there was a decrease in productivity in the labor market. This is why you need to make this assumption to get your results. And at the end, you present a lot of results. For me, it's not clear which one relates clearly to the aim of the paper. So this is just for a start. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Moritz. At the end of the presentations, we will have time for questions. We invite Dr. Santiago Izquierdo and Dr. David Bonilla to join us, please. And we need another chair. Otra silla, José Luis, nos pueden traer. Continuing with session 2, Dr. Santiago Izquierdo from the Institute for Economic Research at UNAM will talk to us about tropical forest frontiers in flux, long-term conservation and development policies in Mexico's Selva Lacandona. Doctor, go ahead.
Thanks very much, Ana Laura. Thanks. I want to thank and congratulate the organizers of this event, Dr. Armando Sánchez, Dr. Aída García, and everyone else. It's been great to be here. So today I'll present this work in progress on some of my work that I've been developing over the last 12 years in Selva Lacandona in Chiapas in Mexico. And it deals with dynamic interactions and interplay between conservation policy on the one hand and economic development policy on the other hand, and what types of tensions and contradictions arise. So this will be part of a special issue in Oxford Development Studies with some other co-authors from the Oxford University and other universities in Latin America. And I've been writing this work in progress with my colleague Julia Carabias and Alan Moreno from Faculty of Sciences and Natura Ecosistemas Mexicanos. It's still pretty much a rough work in progress, so all your feedback will be greatly appreciated. So you'll see that the thematic scope of this project is a bit different from the context of this conference overall, to do with digitalization, education, and labor. But I took some effort on making some connections, specifically with the issue of labor and how it takes place in a rural setting. So I hope at least this research encourages some reflection on what digitalization, education, and labor markets might look like in a rural setting, and what is its link with environmental policy and issues. Also, this work leans more into the qualitative side of my research, to do with the effectiveness of environmental policy and conservation. So for this, and on the context of this special issue, more to do with environmental justice issues, it takes a more political economy approach, a historical approach, trying to understand trends in policy, in its links, but it's not a causal inference project. But this said, we have a lot of data that we've collected over the last 12 years or so, data that spans over 60 years of different types, and I'll describe what these are. So for us, it's just a first step on understanding and making theories around these issues in this context, that we can then test specific issue. So we're welcoming collaborators in this project. So if anyone is interested, please let me know, and I'll proceed with the presentation. So first, I'll provide a context of what tropical forest frontiers are and why they matter. I'll focus a lot of this presentation on the study area as a particular region in Mexico that has very specific dynamics and why it matters. And then some preliminary findings, particularly to do with the evolution of policies, the configurations, some of the outcomes, and then some of the questions that arise from here and what we can test later on with more like causal inference type of analysis. So what do we mean by tropical forest frontiers? We mean these places where there's like a very recent overlap between, let's say, human activity and nature. So they are borders and frontiers where humans are beginning to interact, specifically to do with agriculture in many times. These are very remote settings. Sometimes, particularly in tropical contexts, they're very ecologically valuable settings. So very important harbors of biodiversity, carbon sinks, hydrological services, and so forth. And oftentimes they're linked with poverty, and I'll explain why this link exists. How these tropical forest frontiers emerge. Sometimes they're state-led or induced, as in the case of Mexico, a very extensive land reform process in the 20th century that continues to date in some settings. Some of it has to do with land grabbing and the interconnection between these rural settings and urban markets, and how these like signals in urban markets, particularly to do with commodities and food chains, have impacts in rural settings. So yeah, what are some of the aspects of these settings? They're very rapid transformation. So ecological, to do with land use, land cover, deforestation, and so forth. Economic livelihoods are also changing very dynamically. Social transformations and policy, and that is an important one. Tropical settings are being engaged ever more with in broader climate and biodiversity agendas. So these settings are places where many policies are interacting and they produce interesting effects. Particularly in Latin America, tropical forests are the main sources of new agricultural land, mostly for cattle ranching. And this is mostly to feed urban markets in cattle. So when we think about these issues, the new connection between human societies and nature, we might seem that there's an inherent conflict between human activity and conservation. So this is a picture from one of the study sites where I work. And what you have is that you have a very dynamic landscape where you have different types of policies interacting, protected areas, agricultural support, ranching support, conservation payments, and now carbon offsets. So it's areas where different agendas are competing and interacting with each other. And the types of questions that I'm interested in is, how do these things interact over time? What types of policy configurations take place? How do they evolve? What are some of the outcomes? And particularly, what are local responses? And this has to do with very heterogeneous effects of how people respond to different types of incentives, and what is its impact on the natural base and economic development. A lot of the research in these settings has paid attention to the short-term impact on environmental degradation. So how does settlement and colonization lead to deforestation and land use change? But there's less attention to like longer-term aspects of it. Local agency as a causal mechanism, how people respond differently depending on their culture, their history, or their aspirations. What is the role of these new frameworks, and the recent impact of COVID? So how has COVID affected these type of tropical landscapes when demand has decreased or new markets have been opening? So as a starting point, there's the forest transition theory, which is a theory that if you plot, let's say, environmental conservation or forest cover on the y-axis, and on the x-axis you have economic development, you have a U curve. So it basically says that as you start settling new regions, you have some sort of loss in the natural base that can be that quickly goes down as new roads are built and new markets are formed. But there's some sort of inflection point, and this is the stabilization point, where because of scarcity or changes in urbanization, industrialization, and agricultural modernization, you have an upward slope. So this is the kind of a theory that has been modeling, linking broadly environmental conservation and economic development, but there's very little analysis on how this takes place in tropical frontiers and whether there is a transition, if any, in these settings. No? Another point of departure is this study by Pokorny et al. in Ambio that looks at first policy configurations and how they're influenced by both micro and macro dynamics, and in understanding phases and configurations of these policies on the one hand. Then you understand and evaluate different types of outcomes, whether environmental, social, economic, and then try to make this link. So we're at a stage where we have identified these phases in policymaking. We have a lot of information on social ecological transformations, and what we're trying to do now is to link it. For this study, it will be a more qualitative political economy analysis, but we're open to answering further questions that look at specific aspects of these issues. So the case study is Márquez de Comillas, a municipality in Selva Lacandona, a tropical forest frontier of around 80,000 hectares. Importantly, a place, as many other contexts in Mexico, where it's a state-led colonization process triggered by extensive land reform, but particularly an issue that affects tropical settings across the world is that it's more about distribution of unused lands and natural vegetation lands rather than redistribution of previously lands under cultivation. So it's more about awarding communities forests and tropical forests and jungles that are unused for their settlement. Importantly, in this region, it was a matter of national security considerations and a decision in the 1960s of whether to settle the area or to militarize the area, and the decision was the first. So settle the area and promote the formation of ejidos and indigenous communities in this region. And importantly, this is a melting pot, and this is one of the interesting aspects of this region is that it involves communities formed by people from very different states across Mexico with very different histories and cultures, and this has played out in how they understand their environment, the types of activities that they do, and etc. So this is part of the heterogeneity that I'll be analyzing later on. Importantly, these settings and tropical humid forests are very scarce in Mexico, so it's also a matter of scarcity. From 10 million hectares in the 20th century, you have around 1 million, a bit more than half is in Selva Lacandona. So it's a very important site ecologically, a harbor of biodiversity, a water source, carbon sink, etc. So it's a place where if you expect to find contradictions between development and the natural environment, this is one of it. We have around 60 years of data on socio-ecological transformation. So we have a lot of high-resolution spatial imagery that has been made easier access in recent years, census, socioeconomic surveys, archives, and a lot of primary information tools collected through surveys, in-depth interviews, focus groups, and so forth. So we have amassed a very extensive database, and we're trying to make some sense in this long-term story that then we can link into specific questions for specific topics. So some of the results in policy phases, what we see over these last 60 years is that there's been different configurations when we think about environmental and development policy in this region, but there's always been a tension between them with a very strong agrarian bias. And this is something that characterizes many tropical forest frontiers, a very strong inertia towards agricultural use, and specifically to cattle ranching systems. So from a state-led settlement process to as the region became ever more integrated, and bear in mind, this was a region that was really remote, no road access at all river access, and increasingly it got integrated into the regional economy. This allowed the state to implement different types of schemes, from the Procampo programs from Zagarpa, the Pronasol program, then Cedesol, all these anti-poverty cash transfers and so forth. Then it coincided with a strong growing environmentalism agenda that coincides with Mexico's formation of environmental institutions and how they start overlapping with development. So you have on the one hand, the state disbursing cash transfers for agricultural intensification, for cattle ranching, and on the other hand, also economic incentives for conservation. And they're beginning to be at odds. And the result has to do more with how people understand and how they they use different policy mixes and the types of aspirations that they have in these communities. And more recently, in late 2010s to 2020s, a very important reduction in environmental funding, ramped with another set of different types of new policies for productive landscapes. No? Looking at results in deforestation, and let me see, hope this doesn't flash. So looking at the imagery, what we have in the results after 60 years, a very strong, very impactful deforestation in the last 60 years, but diverging trajectories. So you have the same policies and the same external factors affecting communities, but different responses inside. And this is one of the key aspects that we're analyzing, like how do communities or why do communities have very different trajectories in terms of livelihood activities, how the labor markets play out, and I have a slide on that. So we have these two different trajectories. In one, full depletion, some communities have completely lost their ecosystem, their natural ecosystems, and in others, some sort of stabilization, where people are more diversifying different land uses, using the different policy mixes that they receive to pursue a diversified portfolio. But importantly, this deforestation is not linear. People are very responsive to economic incentives, and we're able to isolate specific impacts of specific policies on certain years, like 2019, 2016, and etc. So from a longer term perspective, you have a trend that's downwards, but you also have a lot of time volatility that we're interested in linking with policy. Economic and social development, so a very important consolidation of agricultural-based livelihoods, specifically cattle ranching, but an important aspect to do with diminishing land productivity, which triggers extensive deforestation. And it has to do with the characteristics of soil and the productivity and the systems that are in place, that very low technology. And the important thing is that, I have this later on, to do with labor markets. So in this type of region, most production still takes place within the household as a productive unit, people using their household endowments that are quite large in this region, about 30 hectares, from 30 to 50 hectares per household, which is a lot. And what the cattle ranching has enabled people to use these 50 or 30 hectares within the household with very little labor requirements and capital requirements. And this is very different to farming, maize cultivation, the milpa system, which are very labor intensive. So it's been the fact that it requires very little labor and very little capital allows for a larger extension of land use. A very important aspect of labor, daily employment and jornales, very high volatility within the region, and a very strong reliance on cash transfers. But at the same time, you have a recent entry of land speculators, and this is people from abroad that are coming into these places, purchasing land with much more capital, and specifically with palm oil, which requires much more, like, larger investments than extensive cattle ranching systems. And added to this, a very important aspects of inward and outward migration from people from Guatemala or people from these communities migrating temporarily to the U.S. So this shows that, like, these labor markets in these regions are quite different from the previous presentations. So this is kind of food for thought on how we think about labor in these places. So some takeaways. This is still quite preliminary, but it seems that a forest transition is not likely in these regions, and it has to do with these labor requirements and capital requirements that allow people to continue the expansion of the frontier until it's depleted. Some stabilization, but more to do with specific policies and micro dynamics than macro trends to do with urbanization and industrialization, which already took place in Mexico a couple of decades ago. This question of whether development and conservation are inherently contradictory, not necessarily. It has more to do with the productive systems in place, and we have some evidence of people transitioning to more forest-based livelihoods to do with ecotourism and other types of activities. And an important part to do with public policies, that these policy contradictions and the fact that different incentives are overlapping reduces the effectiveness of them individually and together as a group too. So people are facing different types of signals, and sometimes they make a decision towards more conservation or more towards deforestation, but the efficacy of each is reduced by these competing dynamics. And with that, I'll leave it. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Santiago Izquierdo. Now we will hear the discussant, Dr. David Bonilla from the Institute for Economic Research.
Thanks, everyone. I have a different version of your presentation, so I can only comment on a qualitative level. I think I have several questions. You talk about economic incentives or conservation. Everyone talks about carbon markets today, and for example, from what I know in the European Union, the emissions trading system has failed because it's basically given lots of profits to German power companies. And the carbon emissions trend, the path of emissions hasn't really shifted. So it's made a lot of wealthy people, a lot of the hedge funds, a lot of the Wall Street financiers, they're pushing for emissions trading systems, but it hasn't really resulted in carbon reductions. And I'm not a specialist in deforestation, but I imagine the same economic and financial instruments will be implemented in your field. And so I'm a little bit skeptical about free market instruments being implemented in deforestation, but I don't exclude them totally. I do agree you need some free market mechanisms, but I still believe you need state-level intervention to stop the deforestation process. So that would be, one of my comments. So basically, in short, you have a monopolization of financial rents by the hedge funds and the people in Wall Street or in London. You talk about state-led settlements. You have an evolution of different changes in Mexico. I would say the Tren Maya, the new train running from, around Yucatan, is basically producing the same phenomena. It's a state-led settlements. It's a subsidy to foreign companies in Tulum and all those, and that's going to create new settlements, right? From my perspective, I'm a transport economist, and we always argue that a large-scale infrastructure of transportation creates the equivalent changes in settlements. So those are my comments for your presentation, but I think I do like the fact that you want to do a political economy approach, and I think that's the right way to go without excluding the quantitative analysis. But I think your presentation is quite interesting. So thank you. Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Bonilla. Now we can go to questions. Dr. Apollo, you want to answer the...
Thank you. I will take the questions. I have reordered the way I will answer the questions for brevity. So I'll start with the what is the match surplus? In a job match between worker and the firm and the worker get a surplus. For the firm, the surplus is when there's a job match, the firm receives some productivity from the worker, but the firm pays a wage and pays a search cost. So the surplus for the firm is a difference between the worker's productivity, the wage they pay, and the search cost, the cost involved in searching for that worker. For the household also gets a surplus from being in a job match. They will earn for a worker in employment, they will earn a wage, and they will also earn the value they would have received if they were in another job, for example. Also, on the converse end of things, if there weren't a match between the firm and the household, the firm leaves the vacancy open, and there's a surplus for that vacancy being open to be filled in the next period. And then for the household might receive, the worker would of course remain non-employed or unemployed and would receive some benefit from non-employment and the value of being employed in the future. So that's how surpluses work for firms and the household. So what we argue here, what we try to show is that the matched surplus, the gain, the value received by the firm and the worker in a job match for non-graduates and informal workers is quite small. And because it's small, it easily breaks down, right? So those job matches between the non-graduates and informal workers have small surpluses, so it will break down more easily, and workers will transition more easily into non-employment. So taking that to our research question, the way we conceptualize things is, it's easy to think about the pandemic and say, oh, the reason non-graduates and informal workers were worse off during the pandemic is because, oh, the impact of the pandemic was larger. They were hit by larger shocks because they're non-graduates or because they're informal workers, were hit by larger shocks, and so the outcome was worse for them. And we think that's a very straightforward way to look at the impact of the pandemic. We think a more nuanced way to look at things is there are existing structural differences between the labor market outlook of non-graduates and informal workers. And it was present before the pandemic and was made worse, exacerbated by the pandemic. And that's what we try to show by saying, suppose instead of just simply assuming that larger shocks hit non-graduates and informal workers, suppose all workers, formal and informal, graduates and non-graduates, were hit by the same shock. What do we see? We see that worse off condition, that small surplus, that high job destruction rate is propelled or is exacerbated by the pandemic. So that's what we try to show by using or applying the same shock or going with the same shock theory. So that's our first research question, to show that because these job matches between non-graduates and informal workers have a small surplus, they would have a shorter tenure, they would break down easily, and when the pandemic came, things became even worse. It tells us that even if everyone in the labor market is exposed to the same shock, the outcome will be worse for some. So that's one question. And then the next question was, can we show all of these complex dynamics with a relatively standard DSG model with search frictions? And so all we try to do is put together what we've observed in the data, model all of this, and see how our simulations compare to what actually happened in the Mexican economy. And to a large extent, our results don't fit exactly, because that wasn't our purpose, to make our results fit the data. Our result was just made to, what our plan was to show first that using the same size of shocks gives results relatively similar, fairly strongly similar to the actual, and that our relatively simple model can summarize, can capture all those complex dynamics that happened during the pandemic. So you asked also about a decrease in productivity. Now, I think the jury is still out on the impact of the pandemic on productivity. I think during the pandemic, I became more productive, but it is the general consensus that productivity declined during the pandemic. So we decided to abstract ourselves from all of that controversy and go with the literature, assuming that productivity fell during the pandemic due to movement restrictions, due to business closures and people working from home, and just the general inefficiencies that come with interruptions from working from home and so forth. So that's why we assumed a decrease in productivity, although I know that not everyone agrees on that. So also you talked about why we chose to model the labor market as we did. Now, I agree that we could have made the model richer. We could have done a lot more, but doing a lot more with this model, with this relatively simple model, we had about 75 variables and lots of transitions. So we had 12 distinct transitions in our labor market. So adding to that would have been interesting, would have been more nuanced, but I think it would have been really, really complicated and would not have helped us answer our research question better, if I may put it that way. And you mentioned changes in behavior of the labor market during the pandemic. And and the shocks. That is another thing we didn't do. We modeled only one shock that decayed all through to the end of the pandemic. But there were waves, for example. There were lots of factors that we have skipped deliberately because it will only add more complexity, and we had already largely answered the questions which we had set out to answer, which is to show that there are structural differences that have been existing in the Mexican labor market, and it is following the data. It is clear that even if all workers were subjected to the same shocks, some workers would turn out worse than others, and that with our relatively simple model, it can say a lot. It can condense and capture all those complex dynamics. So yes, there's much more we could and we're trying to do, but we finally narrowed down to these two.
Thank you, Dr. Arcolo. Please, Dr. Izquierda.
Yes. Thanks very much, David, for those comments. I'll start with the last one on the political economy approach. And yes, I think because of the scope of this special issue, it makes sense to have this more qualitative analysis that looks at these trends. But I think it combines well with other types of research that I'm doing there, specific to do with some policies and their effectiveness and how we can test some mechanisms. I see this more as a kind of theory building article that allows us to understand the region and these dynamics, propose some hypotheses, and then be tested. So it's the kind of the first stage in a more mixed methods type of project, no? To do with carbon markets and free market instruments, and this is something that this is the main scope of my research on what is the role of market-based conservation or incentive-based conservation as a tool for solving the climate biodiversity crisis. And there is, as these things have developed, they face a lot of contestation, and there's very different ways to understand them, to test their effectiveness. But I think what evidence shows after 20 years is that they are not no silver bullet. They might have some gains, but if you think about if you want an important transformation, you need to think about the state. You need to think about markets outside of environmental markets too, and how these things overlap with them. So both as preconditions for effectiveness, but also how to articulate them better within policy frameworks that already exist. What is the role of other macro aspects that are also playing a part in how these things develop as preconditions, and at the same time, a key focus on policy design and implementation, which are key aspects too. So it's the interplay between context, design, and implementation that really is at the crux of these things. And with the Tren Maya, so this is another part of the factors that affect tropical forest frontiers. So some have to do with community settlements that are promoted by states, both because of social justice issues, as a way to solve peasant land demands and so forth. But there's other dynamics too. And this is one where the impact might be the same, but the logic is really different. So if you think about it from a social justice perspective, it's quite different to think about like an extensive tourism project compared to like settlement that have more to do with recognition of indigenous rights and peasant rights and so forth. So it shows the diversity of tropical forest frontiers, and we need to understand like these different aspects too. So yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Santiago. Now, do we have questions? Yes, please.
Thank you. Thank you, Madeline, for the presentation. First question is for you. How do you define a common shock? Because empirically, one can observe that the shocks were different because most of the informal jobs were in, for example, in the service sector was the first affected by the pandemic, and the businesses closed there first than in any other sector. So empirically, how would you conceptualize a common shock? That's something I would like to know more about. And question, more than question, is a comment for Santiago. I think you have very nice variation in data and on competing policies and different areas of Mexico. So there's been new developments on how to evaluate competing policies. This econometrician Chase Martin, who is in UCLA, has developed new models when you have different competing policies, and then you can test which one is driving the results. And I think maybe we can talk during the coffee break and how you could probably use that for your research. I think it has a lot of potential, the data you have. Thank you.
Thank you. Conceptualizing shocks. What we did was to model the pandemic. We had demand shocks, we had supply shocks, we had shocks to job destruction, and monetary policy shocks. Monetary policy shocks are quite straightforward. We just modeled the reduction in interest rates by the Bank of Mexico to tune of about 300 basis points in, I think, 3 different sets. So that's for monetary policy. For job destruction, well, businesses, firms closed down, so those jobs in such firms would have been lost. Shocks to productivity, as I just mentioned earlier, we assume a fall in productivity due to working from home or movement restrictions, social distancing, and so forth. It is still under discussion whether there was an increase in productivity or a decrease in productivity. My beliefs are different, but the conventional approach is that there was a fall in productivity, so that's what we went for. And then demand shock is basically workers losing their job, losing their livelihood, or maybe not losing their jobs, but not being able to work and therefore losing their daily income. So naturally, for non-graduates who are more likely to be in informal employment, it would have the impact of the pandemic would have been much worse, even though all types of workers were exposed to the same shock. Now, how did we choose the size of the shock, for example? We didn't want to get into what is large and what is small. Our purpose for the paper was to apply the uniform size shock to everybody in the labor market, graduate, non-graduate, formal, and informal. So what we did was to choose a reasonably sized shock and applied it to all workers, formal, informal, graduates, non-graduates. Now, we tried different sizes of shock. Remember, our purpose wasn't to fit our results to the data. What we wanted to do was just apply a reasonably sized shock to everyone and just see what our model brings out. So we did try different variations of shock sizes, the same for everyone, and just presented one of the options. Yeah, does that answer your question? Yeah. Thank you.
No, just happy to chat about that. Yeah, thanks.
Another question? Here, please.
Thank you. More than a question, is probably a comment. Obviously, I'm on the name of that paper. So it's for the Discussant. So it's not that the impact is the same for informal and formal workers, but it's that the shock is the same. And then the result shows that the impact is larger for informal workers. So in a way, what we are doing is we even though it's not the purpose of the paper, but we actually replicate the dynamics of the informality. I think you mentioned that what happened with the informality is that it drops sharply in the onset of the pandemic, so the second quarter around 10%, and then it goes back quickly, more than the formal workers. That is what Magdalene shows. But and then the formal jobs didn't recover that quickly. But then what we observed after at the end of the 2020, so the fourth quarter and on, is that the informality slows down. That is what you mentioned. So now it's important to mention that the paper is 2020 So we are not considering like the other quarters, and that might be the reason that we are not showing that behavior. Just wanted to comment that.
So, another question? Yes.
Thank you. Thanks both for the presentations. Just following up again, Magdalene, on this shock, common shock question. Just thinking, so for the job destruction, you are imposing the same proportion of job loss across everybody, right? Just because to me that seems, because of the different industries where you're going to have formal jobs, informal jobs, potential to work from home, more possibly informal jobs and informal jobs. It seems like an area where that assumption might be, require some flex possibly, just because of the nature of the sectors, and whether, I mean, you did mention it's a simple model, and you're kind of, you're not modeling kind of subsequent waves and things like that. Just, I don't know. I guess the question is, how much of a difference do you think it would make to your results if you were able to have some more complex modeling of the nature of the jobs in the different sectors and the responses of those sectors, in terms of, being able to, schemes like, being able to work from home, rather than losing the job altogether. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes. In fact, perhaps what I should have mentioned earlier is it could be both. It could be, or it is. It could be both, that the shocks to non-graduates and informal workers was larger than the shocks to graduates and formal workers. But and that would be the sort of thing you're referring to, that the job destruction ought to be larger for non-graduates and informal workers. So yes, that is valid. But we also, I think with this paper, we wanted to highlight the fact that even if we set aside those differences and subject everyone to the same conditions, some will turn out worse, so just to show the misalignment. But yes, I agree that job destruction and so forth would have been naturally larger by virtue of the occupations, for example. But then that takes us into another level of complexity. How much larger should the shocks to one category be than the other? So I think that brought us back to the fact that, okay, maybe we should look at things in a more nuanced way. And yeah, but I agree that it is both arguments, that there could have been larger shocks to some more than the others. But besides that, setting that aside, some still would have been worse off in the market than others. But yes, you're right. Thank you.
Thank you. We have time for one more question. At YouTube, no? Okay. Do the discussants want to ask?
Just final question. I find, everyone agrees that the crisis was driven by a reduction of demand. But I think it's not in your paper. You assume demand increases, no? False. Okay. But this is the main factor that collapsed the economy and unemployment. No? So how large is that shock? Because I assume that this is the main explanation why employment falls and informal employment increases or whatever happens.
We assumed a 9.5% fall in aggregate demand. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much. Thanks to you. We will be back at 1:30 to continue with the session 3.
Gracias.